Let's talk about the Xbox One and the PS4 and whether or not the Rust Console Edition should be dropping these two systems. Well, the short of it is no, they don't need to drop these systems, and I do think this game is completely salvageable for both base level systems. So let's get into sort of what has to happen here and what the community needs to expect, because there's a lot of people who really think that somehow the Xbox One and the PS4 are going to be able to give you a $2,000 or $3,000 PC Rust experience. That just isn't going to happen. That's not something in the developer's hands. That's not something that anyone could pull off. I don't care what developer you call in. I don't care how much you're paying them. They will probably not be able to get it to happen. And they won't be able to get it to happen. Let's just state that definitively. So what needs to happen for these systems to be able to run Rust is the first thing that needs to happen is I think they need to re-engineer a lot of the textures and assets for this game. This game was originally designed for PC. There wasn't a lot of optimization taken into account for this. And if you look at a lot of these textures and a lot of these designs, they aren't really reduced as much as they could be. There's a lot of things that could be done to make it sort of a lower poly count, which would be basically like how many edges and things like that these assets have, or these models have, and then based on that you can do lower res textures. You combine those two things and you're going to have a much smoother loading experience. In addition to that, I think you're actually also going to be able to sort of shrink the size of those assets. So there's two things to consider when you're thinking about older consoles, right? One, the graphics can't be good, and two, they can't store as many things. Now, if these things are lower res or they take up a smaller amount of space, you can store more of them. It just makes sense, right? So basically, if you want 4K textures, you're probably not going to really be able to get much out of the system. But at the same time, if you want 420p textures, you can fit a shit ton of stuff in there. But you got to, sort of shoot the middle right here. Honestly, if they just do HD textures, they could probably get a lot more into it. But yeah, basically what I think they need to do is they need to go in, they need to re-engineer the textures, simplify some things, and then certain things just need to be pulled out of the game. So for instance, you've got a lot of grass and stuff like that just isn't needed. Pull a lot of that out. A lot of those little rocks that you see sticking out of the ground, flatten the ground, pull those out. On the cliff sides, pull that out. When someone shoots a shotgun and you see all those like explosive animations going in, those need to be completely re-engineered. What's going on right now is a lot of this stuff was sort of a copy paste from the PC. And what you're finding is that doesn't work as good for the consoles. So to start with, the Unity engine isn't the best engine to be running a game on. It tends to be fairly resource intensive, and there are much better, more optimized engines that you could use, but the Unity engine is what Rust was built on. So what really happened here is the console, or the PC developers, Face Punch, they took their version of the game and they just handed it to D11 and said, here, make this code run on the console. It seems easy enough, but there are a lot of problems going into that, right? First off, they need to re-engineer basically how all the buttons are mapped, how everything like that works. They need to re-engineer how building works because you want things to snap a little bit more. They need to re-engineer basically a lot of things that were designed around the keyboard and mouse so that they'll work for the controller. That wasn't, or I think that was what they were mainly doing in this time that they were basically between being given Rust and giving us what we see now. They didn't really worry about how to design maps, how to optimize and everything like that. They basically just tried to cut and paste and move a lot of stuff over so it would work with controllers and the game would run. And that's why if you take a PlayStation 5 or you take an Xbox Series S or an Xbox Series S or X, you get a really good experience. I play on the Series S, and outside of the bugs and outside of a lot of the stuff that's been introduced in trying to fix these issues, it's actually a pretty good experience in my opinion. The problem comes in when you're on a last-gen console. What you run into is there's a lot of issues around graphical lag, and I believe there's like memory, and there's just a lot of issues around processing because these systems cannot handle this game. This game was originally designed for PC, so you lose some of the sort of quality things that you could add basically. So the reason that consoles tended to be better than the PC and tended to outperform them in the past was because developers were programming for that specific system, which means they could directly optimize for it. Knowing a CPU, a GPU, everything like that is going to be in a system means that you can optimize for those specific pieces of hardware, which means your game's going to run a lot better on that hardware, but on something else, it's going to run like complete shit. So now the problem is a lot of games are being made for the PC and then ported over to consoles. In addition for that, you've got a lot of consoles that are just sort of like all over the place, right? You've got the Xbox One, you've got the Xbox One S, Xbox One S, X. You've got the Xbox Series S and the Xbox Series X, and developers are trying to design for all of those, and they all have sort of different hardware requirements. So they can't take those optimizations that they could before, and now everything's just being ported for the PC. This is not a D11 or a Rust problem. This is an industry problem. Consoles have generally just been left out in the dust recently, and what it feels like is a lot of these PC ports just aren't up to snuff. And whereas if you were going the opposite way, right, you design it for the console and then you port it over for the PC, you might be able to make it work a little bit better, because generally by the time you're porting over to the PC, a lot of PC gamers will have better hardware than the console, or they'll have upgraded, right? So if the 2018 version of Rust worked for the console and you wanted to port it over for the PC, by the time they get it to the PC, you're talking about a 2021 PC, and it's going to run a lot better. Whereas with those consoles, what's happened is that technology hasn't moved forward. People aren't able to upgrade the GPU in their console. They just have to buy a new one, and generally we tend not to do that as often. In addition to this, they sort of got screwed because no one can buy a lot of these next gen consoles anyways, which means that we're all on last gen, or a lot of us are on last gen, which means we're running into issues. And D11 was probably hoping a lot of this would just slip under the rug, because there wouldn't be that many people running these things on older gen technology, and now they are. So basically, first two things sort of that we've got to do is there's got to be some optimizations made, and there have to be like a cut down in textures and objects that are sort of on the map. In addition to this, things like shadows can be dialed down. In my opinion, the water is pretty much as bad as it's going to get. I don't know how you make the water worse other than just making it disappear and having some sort of like invisible land that players float through. There's just the water's complete shit in my opinion. You can fix stuff like that. There's things that they can do, like spacing out the pumpkins more. That was something I called out early on that they did, and that actually did reduce lag in a lot of places like Bandit Camp and things like that. Around monuments, reducing the amount of trees that can spawn and things like that is going to actually go a long ways, because again, less stuff for a system to render in that distance. In fact, inside a lot of these monuments like Airfield, I don't think there should be any trees, and even around them, just cut the trees altogether. Next gen can handle it, last gen probably isn't able to, so to reduce monument lag, cut back on that. When it comes to animations, things like that, you've got to cut back on those. Again, this sounds like a lot of stuff that's going to need to get cut, and I think a lot of players don't want that, but that is, in my opinion, the only way that you can get next gen performing at 30 plus FPS. You're going to have to cut down those textures, cut down on the assets, sort of round them out so there's less corners and things like that to be generated. You're going to then need to reduce the amount of objects in an area, so you're cutting back on rocks, you're cutting back on trees. Maybe only so many trees can spawn in a set area. A forest isn't quite going to feel like a forest anymore. It's going to feel more like a savanna with a few trees. And eventually, I think they would be able to get it, but the problem you're going to have with this is it's going to take a while. So when I look at this game and I look at what they're working with, they have a code base that they probably don't want to mess with too much. We can see what happens when they start messing with the code base in a lot of these patches and bugs that are coming out. D11 tries to fix one thing and that breaks something somewhere else. It's hard for me to tell if this is D11's fault or Facepunch's fault, but basically it could be either, right? Because it depends how the code was written. Sometimes what a lot of developers will do is they'll use very generic names for things. For instance, let's say you've got a pen, but instead of calling it a pen, you call it X. 10 years later, you tell someone, get me X, and they give you a lighter. Then you get mad at them because your lighter burnt your paper when you tried to write with it. Is it really their fault, or is it your fault because you called it something stupid? And that's a lot of the problems that are going on in the code base. There's probably a lot of things that are being reused and mixed in there that just don't make sense to developers working on it. And unlike on PC, where you can just sort of keep stacking things up, they've got to start cutting things out. You cut the wrong thing out, you create all these bugs. And sometimes there's a lot of really weird shortcuts that are taken in game design, especially when you don't think a game is going to be around for that long. For instance, if you've got a video game that you're going to go through one iteration like Call of Duty, you can easily just dump a bunch of assets sort of underground and load from there and do some tricks like that that really wouldn't work on anything that's going to be around long term. And maybe Facepunch at one point thought that Rust was going to be sort of a couple year game, and that's when they handed D11 the code before they'd optimized a lot of this stuff. So I think there are some fixes there, but that's going to be really in-depth. Reducing things like the textures and assets, that should be fairly easy if you get a graphic designer in on this and they can sort of re-engineer things. Shaders, you should be able to dial down. You should be able to do things like cut out the amount of things that spawn into monuments. In fact, a lot of these monuments could even be redesigned. Take something like Airfield, for instance. They could cut down on a lot of the stuff. So if you look at the entrance, you've got all these different barricades and sort of little like boxes where you can see like that gate was. I forget what it is. I don't know what it's called. There's like a gate and a guardhouse, right? Like you can cut back on a lot of that stuff to reduce lag. Something like launch site, cut down on a lot of the grass that you see around the road. You can cut back on a few of those towers and things like that, right? It's not going to feel like the same game. There's going to be a lot less of that Rust feel to it, and it's not going to quite feel right for a lot of players. But for last gen, these tricks are going to work. You're going to end up with monuments that sort of feel like bastardized versions of Rust monuments that you see on the PC, but the game's going to run better for you. And what they really should be doing is making these bastardized maps, calling it out in the server. And if you want to join that server, you can. You'll get better performance. And then people who want the full sort of next-gen experience can jump onto the servers that we're playing on today. In addition, this would probably allow them to open up a lot of things like randomized map selection and even custom servers. A lot of people have been saying custom servers can't be created because of last-gen consoles. I don't think that's quite true. I think a lot of the reason that D11 hasn't pushed out updates is because right now they're focusing on last gen, and what they don't want to be doing is giving us more content when most of the player base can't even play the current amount of content, right? It's like if you put, you put a locked door in front of someone and you tell them there's all this gold there and they keep adding to it, and then you ask them why they're not doing anything with it, and it's like, well, I can't get to it. Players can't access the content, so there's really not that much of a point in creating it. It's going to make a lot of us next-gen or current-gen players happy, but it's going to leave a lot of other players out in the dust and feeling just shitty. So they're trying to take care of those players first, but what they're running into is this problem. A lot of those players are leaving because the fixes aren't coming in quick enough, and a lot of next-gen players are leaving because the game's getting stale. There's no way to keep both sides happy unless you start splitting them, unless you start making servers where you say, hey, you're on last gen, this server is not going to be the best experience as far as everything that's there, but you won't lag. And then, hey, you're on, last gen that was. And then for the people who are next gen, say, hey, you're on next gen. If you want, you can play this randomized server with all the monuments that we have available, all this great stuff. It might lag a little bit, but it is going to have all that content that you're really hoping for. And because you're on a system that has better hardware, you're probably not going to have that much of an issue, right? Like when you shoot off a shotgun in the middle of launch site, it's not going to cause your system to lag for 10 seconds, crash, and then, burn down your house. That's just not a thing, whereas on last gen, it might be a fire hazard. You get what I'm saying. They're going to have to split the consoles. I think it's better if they do it right now, and I think it's better if a few of the things that they could do, like re-engineering the textures and cutting back on the graphics for last gen consoles, I think they should just go ahead and pull the trigger on that. It is going to be a completely different experience between the two consoles, but even though this is supposed to be the Xbox One and the PS4 version of Rust that we're playing, they could even just put it in the settings, right? Just optimize graphics or let it rip highest graphics you can get. And, if you're on next gen and you decide to go with the optimized graphics, you're a bit of an idiot, but hey, you can do it. Something like that, I think, is the only solution possible. And a lot of people that are saying that there is no solution, just look at a lot of the games out there, right? If you look at Warzone, that's a game that's done by developers who really designed the game and used a lot of the optimizations, and you can tell because it runs really well on last-gen systems. Something like Ark or DayZ or a lot of these other games, they actually do run on last-gen systems, and they run a lot better than Rust. And part of the reason for that is because they've tuned a lot of those things down, and they've made a lot of those performance tweaks, and I think if we give them time, D11's going to be able to do that. But the big question is, what can they do in the meantime to buy themselves that time? Because right now, server populations are slowly shrinking and the game is slowly dying off. I think there is going to be sort of a renaissance once they can get some new monuments and things like that out. And once they get everything going in their favor again, it's going to be great. Anyways, hope you liked the video. I hope this gave you something to think about and maybe gave some hope to some of you on those last-gen consoles thinking this was a waste of money and completely useless. The game might run. You just have to give D11 time, keep your fingers crossed, and hope that you'll be able to get there. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, peace.